艺人感谢 JZ， 谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们节目的支持。稍后华尔街联报继续为您带来过去24小时的最新消息、评论以及其他精彩内容。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。在深圳这座繁华的大城市，大量城中村的存在提醒着人们这座城市朴素的过去。图片中我们所看到的排榜村就是这样一个典型的城中村，里面遍布低矮老旧的公寓楼和个体小商店，狭窄的小路穿梭其间。在深圳，这样子的城中村有数百个，在全中国则有近5000个。如果一定要定义什么是城中村，那么现在学界对于城中村的一个共识标准就是非户籍常住人口占总人口30%以上，建设用地面积占社区面积40%以上的社区。而中国8大有最多城中村的城市就是北上广深、重庆、成都、武汉和东莞。目前这8个城市总共拥有城中村4427个，涉及人口规模达到5554万，其中非户籍人口占了60%。现在随着中国陷入严重的房地产危机，政策制定者希望改造排榜村这样子的老化社区，来刺激建设和当地经济。但是如果你搜一下新闻，就会发现排榜村说要拆迁已经说了7年了，但是项目至今仍然是停滞不前。要通过改造城中村来救助房地产并不容易。7年前，排榜村就被市政府官员选为城市更新项目。到了2019年，中国最大的房地产公司中国恒大集团接手了该项目。恒大当时已经与业主签订了拆迁协议，谈妥了补偿费用，然而工程还没有开始，恒大就倒了。一直到今年4月，国企深圳地铁接手了排榜村旧改项目。深圳地铁也是另外一家房地产开发商万科的最大股东。前不久我们也报道了深铁正在支持万科的消息，试图以此来安抚投资者。而今年4月至今已经半年过去了，深圳地铁接手了排榜村项目之后，项目总部内仍然挂着恒大的标志，没有任何动静。中国最大的地产开发商们正在陷入金融泥潭，在多年的过度扩张之后，销售放缓，借贷受限。上个月，中国新房平均价格跌幅达到8年来的最大，房地产市场的低迷正在给经济带来压力。依赖土地租赁收入的地方政府也承受着巨大压力。中国政府已经尝试降低利率和放松购房要求，而更大的救助措施可能会给地方预算带来压力。金融监管机构正在绞尽脑汁思考支持开发商的新方法，但同时又不能引起新一轮的投机行为。正是在这样的背景下，中国领导人现在瞄准了城中村。在过去，作为城市化进程的一部分，政府通过吸收村民拥有的农田来扩大城市面积，但是城中村的居民可以保留对其居住区域的集体所有权，这就形成了对国家来说管辖范围有限的小块土地。随着中国城市化进程，高楼林立，街道网格化，城中村逐渐发展成为混乱不堪、人口稠密的居民区，而周围的城市化进程对其影响甚微。大约从2009年开始，随着城市扩张开始耗尽土地，许多地方政府认识到城中村尚未开发的潜力，并且开始重建这些社区。但是一直到今年之前，这主要都是一些地方性的举措。而今年，中央政治局在4月份表示，将在全国21个大城市积极稳步地推进城中村改造。到了7月份，国务院办公厅又印发了关于在超大、特大城市积极稳步推进城中村改造的指导意见，称该政策现在是中国扩大内需的重要措施。伊利诺伊州大学的政治学副教授张悦表示，这确实表明中国领导人正在焦虑地寻找新的城市增长渠道。在2015年的上一次房地产危机当中，北京斥资数千亿美元向居民支出现金用于棚户区改造，由此度过了地产危机。但是现在城中村的翻新更为复杂，成本也可能更为高昂。野村证券在10月份的一份报告中称，这一过程难度高、成本高，而且进展缓慢。中信证券在8月份的一份报告中估计，中国可能需要在10年内每年投资1万亿元。 城中村的公寓楼十分的密集，俗称握手楼。这些公寓往往是破旧不堪，没有电梯，窗户上有铁栅栏，厕所是蹲坑。而街道上则是热闹的商铺、水果店、海产店、二手店或是小餐厅。在排榜村和邻近的另外3个城中村里，住着近6万人，他们中的绝大多数都是从中国其他地方来深圳打工的外来人口。这些城中村常常被称为是梦想的起点。比如说，中国歌手陈楚生在成名之前就是住在深圳的一个城中村。曾经他送过外卖，音乐才华被发现之后，晚上就在酒吧演出。在他后来又为这段经历写了一首歌，叫做《白石洲》。白石洲就是深圳的一个城中村。在歌词里他写道，那里的街道很乱，那里的人很亲近，楼与楼之间的距离只是缝隙。1979年，深圳被确定为中国第1个经济特区。邓小平将一个拥有30万人口的渔村变成了中国资本主义实验的中心。深圳诞生了许多中国最成功的公司，包括华为、比亚迪和腾讯等等。但是随着深圳的发展，房价越来越高，外来务工人员被挤出了深圳新开发的社区。在许多城中村，土地归集体所有，房屋归长期居住的村民所有，但其中许多人其实很早就搬出了社区，因此有很多空余的房屋开始出租。一位在排榜村租住了8年的高先生表示，去年他的房东已经同意把所在的大楼移交给恒大，并且要求他尽快搬走。但是恒大的问题导致城中村重建项目停滞，房东无法完成大楼的出售，而房客则因为获得了缓刑而很高兴。高先生说，旧城改造对我们来说一点好处都没有，我们付不起高昂的房租，也无法再做生意。另外一名小店店主则表示，如果没有外来务工人员，深圳就是一座空城。在北上广深这几个中国1线城市当中，唯独广州和深圳的城中村在数量和活跃度上独树一帜。即使是在福田区这样繁华的 CBD 地区，也少不了城中村的身影。为什么偏偏是深圳诞生如此多的城中村呢？改革开放之后，随着经济的发展，大量人口涌入深圳。在旺盛的居住需求下，不少本地居民抓住机会，在原有的住宅上不断的翻新或者加建，一大批握手楼、亲嘴楼因此而生。这些违建的小产权房组成了城中村的雏形。几十年过去了，城中村不断向外扩张，遍布深圳各个角落，成为深圳城市化进程中的一种特殊现象。同时，大量的廉价居住地又为无数深漂提供了一个落脚地。最高的时候，曾经有70%的人口居住于此，占据了深圳住房面积的一大半。即使是现在，城中村依旧是无数毕业生租房的首选。城中村伴随着城市的发展而生，又因为城市化的加快和中国的房地产危机，走上了要被拆迁的道路。城中村改造除了会导致部分居民无处可住之外，还非常的耗时。因为在拆除建筑物之前，地方政府必须与拥有土地的所有者协商，达成协议。据当地媒体报道，广州今年就进行了127个城中村改造项目。广州市的官员表示，项目平均完工时间从5.5年延长到了7年以上。改造时间越长，成本也就越高。44岁的庄先生在排榜村拥有一栋5层楼高的公寓楼。他10几岁的时候就和家人搬进来了，当时附近几乎没有开发，最近的公交车站也要步行30分钟。而如今排榜村已经有了自己的地铁站，但是庄先生已经不住在这里了。他表示，在排榜村附近没有公园，房屋又离马路很近，对孩子的成长来说不是一个理想的居住环境。这里除了房租便宜，可能也就没有其他的好处了。庄先生现在仍然不确定，他在2020年与恒大签订的出售房屋协议是否仍然有效，或者他是否需要与新的开发商重新谈判。整个项目再也没有消息。目前，他和其他的城中村业主一样，只能够被动的等待。周二，彭博社报道，中国计划为国家城中村改造和保障性住房项目提供1万亿元人民币的低成本融资。以上就是今天新风事件的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢，记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
大家好，欢迎大家收看六度百科节目。本期节目内容如下：通货膨胀、工作、人工智能、罢工，甚至泰勒、斯威夫特 Taylor Swift 都可能是感恩节餐桌上的话题。高管、策略师和专家分享了他们对目前市场上一些最大话题的看法。围绕感恩节餐桌讨论的9个市场主题：雅虎、通货膨胀、工作、人工智能、罢工，甚至泰勒、斯威夫特 Taylor Swift 都可能是感恩节餐桌上的话题。高管、策略师和专家分享了他们对目前市场上一些最大话题的看法。根据美国农业局的数据，由于价格下跌，感恩节大餐的价格与去年相比有所下降，通货膨胀也有所放缓，同比上升 3.2%， 同时出现了通货紧缩。根据 GasBuddy 的预测，汽油价格也接近2020年以来的最低水平，全国平均价格为每加仑 3.25 美元。AAA 预计感恩节假期将产生有记录以来第3高的旅行量。人工智能有望推动下一次工业革命。人工智能公司 OpenAI 今年主导了对话，其母公司 Microsoft 宣布了数十亿美元的投资，以加速其人工智能能力并实现新的增长。到目前为止，美国经济一直远离衰退，但它是分叉的，低收入家庭感受到压力，而高收入家庭则表现更好。房地产市场仍然是一个挑战，美国成屋销售下降到2010年的水平，而建筑商正在寻找促进销售的方法。包括 Alphabet、亚马逊、苹果、Meta、Microsoft、Nvidia 和特斯拉在内的7大科技股占标准普尔500指数市值的 29%， 预计将继续增长。整个2023年的劳资谈判凸显了为工人提供更好的薪酬和工作条件的重要性。然而，整体劳动力市场保持稳定。零售商今年将黑色星期五变成了一个为期1个月的活动，沃尔玛等公司从11月8日开始提供优惠。航空旅行又回来了， TSA 的客运量将超过2019年的水平。泰勒、斯威夫特和碧昂斯音乐会等现场活动推动了2023年的体验经济。感恩节餐桌上的话题。当感恩节的餐桌被摆上烤火鸡、南瓜派和各式美味，话题也如同热气腾腾的菜肴一样丰富多彩。以下是围绕感恩节餐桌可能涌现的9个市场主题，用专业而幽默的方式述说。首先，通货膨胀是个不得不提的开胃菜，它就像是那个不请自来的亲戚，虽然让人有点不舒服，但你知道它总会出现。今年通货膨胀有所放缓，这对于想要节省一些银子的家庭来说，无疑是个好消息。然而，这并不意味着我们可以像购物车里的火鸡一样肆无忌惮地装满购物篮。接着是工作这道主菜，尽管市场上的工作机会似乎比去年感恩节的火鸡还要多，但不是每个人都能轻松找到自己的梦想工作。低收入家庭可能感觉就像是在争抢最后一块火鸡肉，而高收入家庭则可能在享受额外的蔓越莓酱。然后是人工智能，这个话题犹如科技界的甜点，总能引起热议。OpenAI 和微软的合作就像是在传统的南瓜派上撒了一层高科技的糖霜，让人期待它能带来怎样的改变。谈到罢工，这就像是餐桌上的辣椒酱，虽然不是每个人都能接受，但它确实增加了讨论的热度。今年的劳资谈判就像是一场没有终点的宴席，我们都希望最终能找到一个让每个人都满意的解决方案。泰勒、斯威夫特和碧昂斯的音乐会就像是感恩节餐后的娱乐节目，他们推动着体验经济的繁荣，让我们在享受美食的同时，也能享受精神上的盛宴。房地产市场则像是那道众说纷纭的菜肴，有人觉得它煮过头了，有人则认为它还没煮熟。尽管成屋销售的热度已降至2010年的水平，但我们仍然希望能在这个领域找到一些好吃的房产。科技股的表现就像是餐桌上的调味品，总能给投资者的投资组合增添一些风味。尽管他们占据了市值的大头，但我们都知道，过分依赖他们就像是在火鸡上放太多的盐，可能会毁了整顿饭。汽油价格的下降就像是一瓶好酒，让长途驾驶回家的旅程变得更加愉快。而感恩节假期的旅行量预计将创下历史第3高，这无疑为汽油价格的酒增添了几分喜悦。 最后，零售商将黑色星期五变成了1个月的购物狂欢，这就像是餐桌上的自助餐，每个人都可以找到自己喜欢的东西。沃尔玛等公司的提前促销就像是提前上桌的开胃菜，让人们对即将到来的盛宴充满期待。在感恩节这个充满感激和分享的节日里，无论是讨论市场动态还是品尝美食，都是为了庆祝过去1年的收获，并期待未来更多的可能。所以，让我们在感恩节的餐桌上，不仅分享食物，也分享智慧和幽默，共同享受这个温馨的时刻吧。通货膨胀对消费者有什么影响？通货膨胀这个经济学中的老朋友，就像是一块永不消融的冰块，总是悄悄地滑入消费者的饮料中，让你在品尝清凉的同时，也感受到一丝丝的苦涩。在详细探讨通货膨胀对消费者的影响时，我们可以用一些幽默而智慧的比喻来描绘这一复杂的经济现象。首先，通货膨胀就像是厨房里的烤箱，它能让物价烤得越来越高。就像面包在烤箱中膨胀一样，货币随着时间的推移也会失去购买力。消费者会发现，随着通货膨胀的加热，他们的钱包好像被放进了微波炉，里面的钞票就像是爆米花，膨胀后的体积大了，但实际价值却没有增加。其次，通货膨胀会影响消费者的购买决策。就像在餐厅里点菜时，菜单上的价格突然上涨，你可能会犹豫是否还要点那道昂贵的牛排。同样，当通货膨胀导致生活成本上升时，消费者可能会更加仔细地考虑每一笔支出，有时不得不放弃某些非必需品或奢侈品。第三，通货膨胀会侵蚀储蓄的价值。这就像是在沙滩上建造沙堡，随着潮水的上涨，沙堡逐渐被侵蚀。对于那些辛苦攒钱的人来说，通货膨胀就像是不请自来的潮水，悄悄地吞噬着他们的储蓄。此外，通货膨胀可能导致利率上升。当通货膨胀像一只饿极了的狼一样在敲门时，中央银行就会像一个严厉的父母，提高利率以管教这只狼。这对于贷款和信用卡持有者来说，意味着他们需要支付更多的利息，就像是在购物清单上不得不加上额外的税费。通货膨胀还会影响工资增长。在通货膨胀的背景下，即使工资名义上增加了，实际购买力可能并没有提高。这就像是在跑步机上跑步，尽管你在不断前进，但实际上并没有离原点更远。在通货膨胀的环境中，退休金的实际价值也会受到影响。退休金就像是一瓶陈年的葡萄酒，理应随着时间的流逝而变得更加珍贵。然而，通货膨胀就像是不断升温的室温，会让这瓶葡萄酒的风味逐渐减弱。然而，通货膨胀对债务人来说可能是个好消息。这就像是你欠了一条巨龙1桶金币，随着通货膨胀的进行，这桶金币的重量似乎在减轻。换句话说，随着货币价值的下降，债务人需要偿还的实际价值也会减少。最后，通货膨胀可能会导致经济的不确定性增加。这就像是在一个暴风雨即将来临的海滩上放风筝，虽然风筝可能会飞得更高，但同时也更容易被风吹走。消费者和投资者在面对通货膨胀的不确定性时，可能会变得更加谨慎，从而影响整个经济的稳定性。总而言之，通货膨胀对消费者的影响是多方面的，它既是挑战也是机遇。就像在厨房里烹饪一道复杂的菜肴一样，我们需要精心调配各种食材，以确保最终的成果既美味又营养。同样，在通货膨胀的环境中，消费者需要智慧地管理自己的财务，以确保在经济的大海中稳稳地扬帆前行。人工智能在工作场所的发展会如何改变就业市场？在现代工作场所，人工智能 AI 的到来就像是一位全能的新同事，它不仅会改变办公室的座位布局，还会彻底重塑就业市场的面貌。让我们用一点幽默和智慧，探索这位新同事带来的变革。首先， AI 在工作场所的发展意味着某些重复性和预测性强的工作将逐步由机器人接手。这就像是让一个终极多面手来处理那些让人打瞌睡的任务，从而释放出人类同事们的时间，让他们可以专注于更有创造力的工作，就像是从整理文件柜升级到设计室内装潢一样。其次， AI 将成为数据分析的超级英雄。它能够迅速处理和分析大量数据，为决策提供支持，就像是在黑暗中点亮一盏明灯， 帮助企业找到前进的方向。这将提高效率，减少人为错误，同时也可能让一些分析职位变得过时。第三， AI 的发展将推动远程工作的普及。随着智能助手和自动化工具的帮助，工作可以在任何地方完成，不再受地理位置的限制。这就像是给每个人配备了一个虚拟的飞毯，让他们可以在任何地方展开工作的魔毯。此外， AI 将导致技能需求的转变。未来的员工需要具备与 AI 合作的能力，就像是学会与一个来自不同星球的新邻居交流一样。这意味着终身学习将变得更加重要，因为技能更新的速度将比以往任何时候都快。AI 还可能会带来新的职业机会。随着 AI 技术的发展，将会出现一些我们现在无法想象的新职位，就像是科幻小说中描述的星际旅行顾问或者虚拟现实游乐园设计师一样。然而， AI 在工作场所的发展也可能导致就业市场的不平等加剧。那些能够适应新技术的人可能会获得更多机会，而那些不能的人则可能会被边缘化，就像是在一场数字化的马拉松中落后了。AI 还会改变工作场所的人际关系。与 AI 合作可能会减少同事间的直接交流，这就像是在家庭聚会上每个人都低头玩手机一样，虽然大家都在同一个房间，但彼此之间的交流却减少了。最后， AI 将改变我们对工作的认识。随着机器接管更多的任务，人类的工作可能会更加注重创造力、情感智能和战略思考。这就像是从一个按部就班的厨师转变为一个无拘无束的美食创作家，需要不断的创新和尝试新的食材组合。总结来说，人工智能在工作场所的发展将是一场革命，它将改变我们做事的方式，我们学习的内容，我们交流的方式，甚至是我们对工作的整体看法。它既带来了无限的可能性，也带来了挑战。我们需要像是在玩一个巨大的经济版椅子游戏一样，不断调整位置，以确保当音乐停止时，我们每个人都能找到座位。在这个游戏中，最重要的不是速度，而是适应能力和预见未来的智慧。谢谢您收看六度百科，这是由一群科学家、经济学家、专业媒体人、工程技术人员合作制作的百科类节目。这些内容并不一定反映六度百科团队的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度百科内容涉及诸多知识领域，我们努力使其内容真实、专业，不存在预设立场。如果受众发现内容有误，赞同或反对六度百科内容，请在我们的节目留言区发表您的高见。欢迎大家到六度世界 六度 World 阅读我们的更多内容，参与六度聊天区的讨论。请订阅我们的频道，给我们的节目点赞，谢谢。
大家好，我是六度世界的六博士，我与小六子为大家主持财经101关于财经股市的扫盲课。节目主要内容包括：一、量化交易，算法的博弈场；二、绿色能源投资，环保也能赚钱；三、保健品市场，健康是第一生产力。那么，小六子可以先跟我们说说量化交易，算法的博弈场。
好的，让我们来谈谈这个现代金融界的魔法师们——量化交易者。他们使用的不是古老的占星术或者神秘的预言，而是数学模型和计算法。这些工具就像是他们的魔杖和水晶球。量化交易，简单来说，就是利用数学模型来分析市场，然后用计算法自动执行买卖指令。这就像是你在玩一场高速版的棋盘游戏，但是你的对手不是坐在你对面的人，而是全世界的计算机程序。想象一下，一群穿着格子衬衫的数学天才和计算机工程师坐在一个充满大屏幕和闪烁的灯光的房间里。他们不是在玩最新版的视频游戏，而是在设计能够在毫秒级别做出决策的算法。这些算法就像是市场上的忍者，悄无声息地进行交易，而且速度快得让人眼花缭乱。有趣的是，这些算法有时候会像是有自己的性格一样，有的像是胆小的学生，只在最安全的时候才会小心翼翼地进行交易，有的则像是赌徒，不惜一切代价去追求高风险的交易。当然，这些性格都是由他们的创造者——量化交易者赋予的。这场博弈不仅仅是算法之间的对决，还涉及到心理战和策略布局。量化交易者必须不断地调整他们的模型，以应对市场的变化和其他算法的策略。这就像是一场无止境的棋局，每一步都必须精心计算。有一个著名的故事是关于两个主要的量化交易公司在毫秒级别的争斗。 他们的算法被设计来捕捉对方的模式，然后在对方做出交易之前就下单。这就像是两个西部牛仔在决斗，谁拔枪快谁就能生存下来。但是这场游戏并不总是公平的，有时候一些算法会利用市场的漏洞进行所谓的闪电交易，这让他们能够在其他交易者之前看到市场订单，从而获得不公平的优势。这就像是在赛跑中穿上了喷射背包，其他人还在用脚跑，而你已经飞起来了。总之，量化交易是一个充满智慧、速度和技术的世界。它可能不像古代的剑与魔法那样浪漫，但在这个数字化的时代。
谢谢小六子的介绍，那再跟我们介绍一下绿色能源投资，环保也能赚钱。
好的，让我们来聊聊这个让地球母亲既感动又感激的话题——绿色能源投资。这不仅是一个环保的行动，更是一种让你的钱包鼓起来的智慧选择。毕竟，谁说做好事不能让银行账户数字跳水舞呢？首先，我们得承认，过去的工业革命就像一场盛大的派对，人类烧炭烧油狂欢，地球却在角落里默默地喝住悲伤的酒。但现在，我们终于意识到，这场派对的清洁费用实在太高昂了。于是，绿色能源就像那位时尚又有责任感的新朋友，告诉我们，嘿，我们可以边玩边保护环境，而且还能赚钱哦。绿色能源投资包括了太阳能、风能、水能等可再生能源的开发与应用。这些能源就像是地球送给我们的无限礼物卡，只要我们愿意去兑换，就能源源不断的获得能量。而且，这些能源的使用不会留下环境污染的尾巴，这就像是在赚钱的同时还能获得道德加分，何乐而不为呢？有趣的是，投资绿色能源也像是在玩一场大型多人线上角色扮演游戏。你需要组建一支队伍，包括科学家、工程师、政策制定者和投资者。每个人都有自己的技能和任务，而你的目标就是打败那个大魔王——气候变化。当然，这场游戏的奖励是真金白银以及一个更加宜居的地球。不过，就像任何投资一样，绿色能源投资也有其风险。技术的进步可能会让某些设备过时，政策的变化可能会影响收益。但正如古人所说，不入虎穴，焉得虎子。如果我们想要获得可持续的未来，那么我们就得有勇气去冒这些风险。最后，让我们以一个小故事结束这次的分享。有一位投资者问他的财务顾问，绿色能源投资的最佳时机是什么时候？财务顾问微笑着回答：20年前。投资者沮丧地低下头。财务顾问又说，第二个最佳时机是现在。投资者的眼睛亮了起来，因为他明白，对于保护我们唯一的家园，永。
谢谢小六子的介绍，那再跟我们介绍一下保健品市场，健康是第一生产力。
各位亲爱的学生朋友们，今天我们来聊一聊一个古老而又现代的话题——保健品市场。这个市场可谓是历史悠久，从古埃及人的蜂蜜和芦荟，到中国的人参和灵芝，再到现代的胶原蛋白和益生菌，人类对于健康的追求从未停歇。首先，让我们来谈谈一个经典的概念：健康是第一生产力。这句话的意思是，如果你健康如牛，那么你就能够像牛一样勤劳工作，生产出更多的财富。这个概念在保健品市场上被演绎的淋漓尽致，广告中常常会告诉你，只要吃了这个保健品，你就能够拥有超人的体力和不老的青春。但是，历史上的人们对于这种追求健康的方式可是有诸各种各样的试错。比如在中世纪，欧洲人相信麝香和水银能够治疗瘟疫，结果不仅没有治好瘟疫，反而让不少人中毒身亡。再比如，我们的好朋友罗马皇帝尼禄的老师塞内卡，他就曾经说过，我们不是因为没有时间而无法健康，而是因为我们浪费时间在无用的保健品上。看来，对于保健品的质疑可是自古就有。当然，我们也不能一棍子打死所有保健品。科学研究证明，某些维生素和矿物质补充剂对于特定人群是有益的，比如孕妇补充叶酸可以预防胎儿神经管缺陷。但是，这并不意味着所有的保健品都是必须的，或者对每个人都有效。所以，亲爱的同学们，当你们走进那些光鲜亮丽的保健品商店时，记得用你们的历史知识和批判性思维来分辨真假。不要忘了，最好的保健品往往是免费的、均衡的饮食、适量的运动和充足的睡眠，这些才是真正的第一生产力。
谢谢小六子的介绍。最后，我想邀请各位观众们一起讨论一下，你对于量化交易的看法是什么？你认为它是一种聪明的投资策略，还是一种不公平的竞争方式？又或者你对于绿色能源投资有何想法？你认为它是未来的趋势，还是一种风险较大的投资？最后，对于保健品市场，你是否相信其中的神奇效果？ 你是否认为健康就是财富的最重要组成部分？请在评论中与我分享你的想法吧。谢谢大家收看6度历史系列节目。这个节目由媒体专业人士、科学家、工程技术人员编纂、设计、制作。但是，这些内容并非用于做出决策或法律裁定的基础。欢迎在节目留言区发表您的见解，纠正节目可能存在的错误。谢谢大家收看。欢迎订阅我们的频道，给我们节目点赞。
APEC leaders meeting looming 1 week out, and the expectation that President Biden and President Xi will meet at that event. This is sort of an important opportunity for us to take stock of where things are and what we should expect when the two leaders sit down together. What will be the implications diplomatically in terms of the security situation on Taiwan, regional security, as well as broader strategy. And I'm thankful that we have some of the brightest minds in the world with us today to help us think through these challenges. Oriana Schuyler Mastro is a fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and also a professor here at Stanford. She also serves in the Air Force Reserve. Patricia Kim is a fellow at the China Center, as well as the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. She is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, as well as the politics and security in East Asia. Colin Call is a senior fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute, a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Pentagon, an alumni of the Obama White House, where he and I first had an opportunity to work alongside each other. And of course, Gita Wirjawan is a visiting scholar at Stanford. He is a former Indonesian Minister of Trade, and he is widely recognized as a man of many abundant talents.
Too long. Notice you didn't say that about the rest of us.
So with that, I just want to get us started. The way that we're going to proceed is I'm going to ask these panelists a few questions to get the conversation going. We will reserve time at the end for your questions, your answers, your reactions. So please feel free to organize your thoughts. But to get us started, I was wondering if I could just ask all of you, if you could identify what do you think are the top 1 to 2 factors that will drive the narrative around the meeting between President Biden and President Xi? What will determine whether or not it is optically viewed as a success? Colin, can we start with you? Maybe we'll work our way around.
Sure. I mean, to some degree, simply having the meeting is the purpose. I think there's a lot of anxiety around the world about the deterioration in the U.S.-China relationship. I don't think the meeting is going to stop the fact that there's a lot of competition and a lot of tension between Washington and Beijing, but I think the world is looking for a signal that the world's 2 leading powers are committed to putting guardrails around the relationship so that competition doesn't turn into conflict. So I think in part the meeting is the message, but I do think it'll be interesting to see if a couple of things come out of the meeting. One is what did they say about the ongoing conflict in the Middle East? I'm sure that President Biden will continue to press President Xi on restraining Iran and its allies from entering the conflict. I think, the United States and China have very different perspectives on the conflict, but I think they share an interest in the conflict now expanding beyond Israel and Gaza to engulf the rest of the region. So I think people will be looking at that. I don't expect a lot of public messaging on Ukraine, but I suspect this will be a topic that the 2 presidents talk about in private quite a bit, where Biden will continue to press Xi on not providing significant support to the Russian military effort in Ukraine. I'm sure they'll talk about other issues as well. Clashes with the Philippines and around the second Thomas Shoal. There's a whole host of issues. And the only other thing I'll say publicly is we've got a couple of things going on in the last week that I think it'd be interesting to see if they get highlighted. One is there was an enormous amount of activity around artificial intelligence last week. The artificial intelligence executive order, you had the G7 statement, you had the Declaration of Principles on the responsible integration of AI into military systems that was signed by 31 countries, but not China. You then had the UK Safety Summit, which generated a statement that China did sign onto. And so there's just a lot of momentum around norms and principles for AI. And I think that, again, this is an area where competition between the United States and China is fierce, but arguably they have a shared interest in preventing some of the worst, low probability, high impact existential risks that might emerge from some of these large AI models. So it would be interesting to see if that makes it into the public domain. And then lastly, there is for the first time in a number of years, a Chinese delegation in Washington today to discuss arms control and strategic stability, which has been a big theme for for Biden when he's met with Xi in the past. I don't think we should expect anything meaningful to come out of the meeting, but the fact that they're having the meeting is important because, again, I think the world is looking to see whether the two military superpowers can start to have a framework for conversations around these things.
Great, thank you.
So I, generally speaking, I agree with what Colin said, and I do believe obviously having the meeting is more progress than not having it. But I also think it's kind of like a couple who's decided to get divorced, but they show up to Thanksgiving and still haven't told any of their family members. I mean, the fact that the purpose of this is to signal to the world, like, that the world wants the stability in the relationship, and we're going to show up and we're going to sit side by side, and like most of these meetings make some sort of positive statement. I think, to me, I would not be reassured if I were the rest of the world. It seems a bit empty to me. Now, of course, I have a few categories of, the low end, high end of, how successful this meeting would be. Of course, what they're saying is just meeting is success. So on the low end, basically, there are no real deliverables. On the higher end, you have some deliverables, but the nature of those deliverables, I think, will tell you how successful the meeting is. So first, there's like sort of non-traditional versus traditional security stuff. I think if they're going to get anything done, and maybe they don't make this in terms of a public statement because it's not as sexy as some of the other issues, but some of the things that are being thrown around are things like establishing more direct flights between the United States and China, agreements on fentanyl and other concerns that the United States might have. These are sort of more non-traditional areas that don't open up a whole Pandora's box of more sensitive issues that if the Chinese and the Americans wanted to show goodwill, there is this viewpoint that I don't necessarily agree with, but this viewpoint that you can build goodwill at these lower level issues, and maybe somehow that will trickle up and help us with the more serious ones. The second category I'd put things is global versus regional. So I think it would be good if there were discussion of some of these global issues like the conflict in the Middle East, but from the Chinese perspective, those are less hot and button issues than the regional ones, right? So if you talk about the global issues, China right now is trying to present itself as a purveyor of global security goods. I was just in Beijing last week for this defense forum, which is basically a couple of days of Chinese propaganda. And they talked about the conflict in the Middle East more than they talked about Taiwan, as a way to demonstrate that the United States is not a responsible global leader, but China will be. So I'll also be looking for that balance. Like, are they going to say sort of anything about, the South China Sea, Second Taiwan Shoal, and obviously the hot button issue of all hot button issues, Taiwan. And the third thing is, in the context of those issues, is either side going to acknowledge the concerns of the other, or are they just going to parrot how their position is the correct position and the other side is right? So kind of the content and tone of any statement being made. And the last thing, which doesn't suggest that it's a complete success, but it's something, is whether there's a commitment to a sustained agenda of meetings moving forward. So as long as the Chinese continue to use cutting off of dialogue as a strategic means of demonstrating when they're unhappy about things, even if the Chinese, like this time, say, okay, we're going to meet, if there's not a lot of warning, there's not a lot of prep time. We have whole bureaucracies that are designed to prepare our leaders to say, this is the deliverables we want, this is the information you have. And if we never know if the Chinese are going to show up until the last minute, I think that does restrict in the long haul what we can get done. So those are a few of the factors that I'll be looking at.
Thank you. Patty?
Very well. I think Colin and Oriana covered a lot of ground. I think, as they both say, everyone will be watching to see sort of the meeting for the tone that it sets for the U.S.-China relationship and kind of hints about what to expect from the relationship in the coming months. I think the Chinese system will be watching for whether Xi is treated with respect in the United States that befits the head of a great power, that he isn't embarrassed or comes away looking like a supplicant, especially since he's coming here to the United States, rather than the other way around. I think in the US, there will be scrutiny around whether President Biden makes any seeming concessions or promises to Xi at the expense of US interests and the interests of allies and partners. And so that's where sort of the scrutiny will be politically. The challenge is, I think, the US and China have traditionally had very different views on what are the best practices for stabilizing the relationship. Here in the US, there's this tendency to put a greater focus on building practical guardrails that could reduce the risk of escalation, like strengthening communication between both militaries, and on advancing cooperation on global challenges such as climate change or arms control. Whereas in Beijing, you often hear, the US first needs to acknowledge China's core interests on Taiwan, promise not to undercut the legitimacy of the CCP by criticizing China's human rights records, for instance, or, and so on and so forth. And if the US does this, then anything and everything else is possible. That's where they often start. And so I think this is really a difference in American and Chinese styles of doing business, where the Chinese like to set a broad framework and tone for the relationship and then talk about specifics and mechanics, whereas in the US, we're often keen to start with more practical steps and see that as an ability to build trust and momentum. I think the political systems on both sides are cognizant of these differences, and no one has illusions that the demands of the others will be fully satisfied and that we can negotiate away all of our differences. I think there's a lot of reality on both sides, especially now. And so in terms of whether the meeting is judged a success, I think if both leaders are able to give a nod towards the other concerns while avoiding the potential pitfalls and criticisms in their home systems, the meeting would be judged a relative success.
Yeah, as a Southeast Asian, as somebody who's attended the APEC summit 5 years in a row, starting with Singapore, Yokohama, Honolulu, Vladivostok, and Bali, it just appears to be like so many of the other multilateral meetings. And I put this in the context of how we Southeast Asians have viewed multilateralism significantly on a decline in the last, I would guess, decade or so. And we're sort of like viewing the United States as a country that finds it very difficult to embrace multipolarity. And I try to, basically raise the awareness that, ironically, in a much more multipolar world, multilateralization becomes much more difficult. And I got a good taste of that as a trade minister entering into discussions on RCEP and much less the early stage of TPP, which unfortunately didn't happen. I get the sense that, and I share, I think, the views of many of my Southeast Asian fellows, that the United States finds it very difficult to embrace multipolarity. And I'm fully cognizant of the fact that history has always been filled with multipolarity. And at the rate that the United States will find it difficult to embrace multipolarity, it might get more exhausted than necessary. And having seen the security concerns taking place in Ukraine and recently in West Asia, we in Southeast Asia are even more concerned now that there's not a whole lot of bandwidth for the United States to be allocating for purposes of peace and stability. So those are, I think, some of the things that are occupying the minds of many Southeast Asians at the moment. Now, I do agree with the other participants that I think the bar is very low for the meeting between Xi and Biden, but I do have a wish list. And the wish list, I think, consists of two things. First is really AI. AI is, I think, a subject that's filled with hallucinations that are being pumped with hypnosis that I think don't lead up to anything benign and judicious at the rate that it's not being attended to in a much more multidisciplinary manner. The second would be sustainability. And I've raised this paradox of sustainability where the narrative of sustainability is something that's just a little too elitist. It resonates to only 10 to 15% of the population of the planet where the rest are just only concerned about putting food on the table. The demand side is easy. I can socially re-engineer anybody to stop using coal as long as there is an alternative that's affordable. The problem is there isn't. The supply side is also doable from a technological standpoint, but not from an economic standpoint. And this is where I think my wish would be that conversations between the two most powerful people in the world would try to figure out a way so that the economics would work out for 80% of the planet. So that's really where I am right now.
Thank you. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But before we do, Patty, can you help us understand why the meeting between President Biden and President Xi is taking such, what is making it such a high visibility?
Well, this would be the first time that Biden and Xi would be meeting since they met last November on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali. At that time, the two presidents had agreed to manage competition responsibly, to empower their deputies, to open channels of communication, and to look at ways we can cooperate on climate change and global food security and so on. And I think the meeting was seen as a good, solid start to stabilizing the relationship. But of course, everything came to a halt after the Chinese spy balloon crisis in late January. And so since then, since the summer, we've seen a steady effort by both sides to resume diplomatic engagement and build momentum towards this leader-level meeting at APEC. We've seen Secretaries Blinken, Yellen, and Raimondo go over to China. And I think these efforts were motivated by a recognition in both systems that without stabilizing the relationship, without regular dialogue, and without better channels of communication, there is a real chance that we can stumble into a military conflict, whether in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, where Chinese, US, and US partners are operating in close proximity to one another. And any US-China conflict out there would be catastrophic, not just for the US, but for the entire world, and China, but for the rest of the world. And in addition to any casualties that would result from a military engagement, I think some sort of US-China standoff would essentially trigger the full decoupling of the US and Chinese economies, which is something that we've tried to avoid, even as both sides look to de-risk and to reduce their dependencies on each other, given how costly full-scale decoupling would be. And if there were to be some sort of confrontation in the Taiwan Strait, for instance, half of the world or more of trade passes through this area. So again, everyone would be affected. But even without getting to such extreme scenarios, I think if the US and China fail to work out a functional relationship, the fact is that many global challenges would go neglected, whether we're talking about climate change or regional crises like the Middle East, where, Colin, as you said, the US and China have different positions and don't always have all the same interests, but nevertheless still have an interest in preventing the spread of conflict, and they don't want to see a prolonged war or certainly the humanitarian impacts of the wars that are going on. So I think we've seen some positive momentum in the recent weeks with several groups like the Financial and Trade Working Groups meeting for the first time. There's the dialogue on arms control or strategic stability that started up for the first time since the Obama administration. And it'll be interesting to see if there are any other hints of other working groups that might be stood up after the two leaders meet. But I think, again, the most important result of this meeting would be sort of a signal by both sides that the leaders are committed to putting the US-China relationship in a more stable and constructive trajectory. And I think this is really important, especially in a top-down system like China, where President Xi, what he says and how he describes the US-China relationship really sets the tone and the direction for the bureaucratic apparatus in China. And of course, I think the real test will be whether this momentum can be maintained in the months and years after this meeting, or whether things will fall apart again if there's some other crisis, which there inevitably will be. And there's certainly no shortage of potential friction points with the elections coming up in Taiwan, our own elections around the corner. And of course, the two countries sort of operating in close quarters out in the region. And so there's a lot of reasons why it could fall apart. I don't know what the answer is for creating durable mechanisms. It'd be interesting to talk about what that might be. But yeah, I think that's where I would leave it.
So Patty introduced the risk of incident that could escalate and be very difficult to control. In recent weeks, the Department of Defense has begun publicizing examples of unsafe and unprofessional intercepts. And the Chinese have reciprocated with their own evidence of what they claim to be unsafe American maneuvers. Why, Colin, help us understand what's going on here. Why is this happening now?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, part of it's happening because the volume and velocity of these incidents is going up dramatically. So, a couple of weeks ago, the DoD put out its annual China military power report. There was a briefing that Assistant Secretary Ratner, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, and Admiral Aquilino did at the Pentagon, particularly calling out these unsafe and unprofessional intercepts. And, U.S. documentation suggests that in the last 2 years, there have been 180 unsafe and unprofessional intercepts by PLA forces, just of U.S. aircraft. If you add on allies and partners like the Australians and the Canadians, you get close to 300. That is more than in the entire decade prior to those statistics. And so much so that the Pentagon at least has come to the conclusion that this isn't rogue pilots. This is an intentional act by the Chinese leadership to basically introduce what Thomas Schelling would call the threat that leaves something to chance, right? That basically if you operate, even if you're operating in international airspace, and all of these incidents are happening, let's be clear, over international waters in international airspace. These are not U.S. spy planes intruding on Chinese territory. But China's reaction is that our activities in their neighborhood is provocative, and they're introducing friction and risk into that as a way to try to box us out. And the challenge, of course, is that that's not going to work because the U.S. military and this administration, any administration, is going to be committed to sailing and flying anywhere that international law allows the United States to do so. The world recognizes that right. This is not China's sphere of influence. This is international territory. So there's a real risk that you could get an incident. And I'll just highlight two examples. A year and a half ago, you had an Australian manned reconnaissance aircraft flying over the South China Sea where a PLA fighter aircraft came right over the top and released flares and chaff back into the engine of the Australian aircraft. That could have been a deadly episode that would have immediately implicated U.S. treaty obligations with one of our closest allies in the Indo-Pacific. And then just a couple of weeks ago, you had a PLA aircraft that came within 10 feet of a U.S. B-52 strategic bomber flying in international airspace over the South China Sea and flew at high velocity under the wing. Extraordinarily dangerous. So I think there is a real prospect that if the PLA keeps this up, something can go bump in the night between the world's two leading military powers, and in a very different context than the last time this happened back in 2001, where the politics and the geopolitics of this are much more complicated, much more fraught, and much more tense. So the reason I think that the Pentagon is highlighting this is to put the world on notice of what the PLA is doing. So that when and if an incident happens, and the U.S. will do everything possible to avoid such an incident, but that the world understands the history behind this. Because frankly, if an incident happens, whether it's with the United States or an ally partner, managing that scenario what will be really critical is that it's not just Washington versus Beijing, that actually the international community is focused on this and focuses on the parties to de-escalate and focuses on getting access to crash scenes. And there's a whole bunch of scenarios in which it is as awful as this will be, it will be better if the international community is focused on it and is not immediately made a US-China thing. The last point I will make is, and we start off with the Biden-Xi meeting, the US has repeatedly pushed the PRC to thicken crisis communications mechanisms. This is not, this is, a lot of times this is talked about in terms of like hotlines. As you know, Ryan, we have phone numbers. There are secure and non-secure. It's not about telephones and whether we can, it's whether anybody on the other side will pick up the phone. And the problem is they won't. I remember, we reached out repeatedly around the spy balloon episode to include right before we shot it down to arrange calls between our Secretary of Defense and the Minister of Defense in China, and crickets, nothing. They didn't want to talk to us. And it's extraordinarily irresponsible. It's extraordinarily dangerous. And, if China is going to be, think of themselves as a great power and a world power, it's, to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And so they have a responsibility. They have a responsibility. Actually, I think it was Peter Parker's uncle that said it, but in any case, they need to grow up and act like a mature power. Now, their answer when Americans make these complaints is kind of twofold, which is you want crisis management mechanisms so you can have more crises. It's like it's a moral hazard argument, right? Like you want seatbelts so you can get in more car accidents, which last time I checked is actually not why we want seatbelts. But the other part of it is they have a retort, which is common, which is, if you don't want crises, there's a simple answer: get out. Like, you are not a Pacific power, which is strange because we're sitting here in Stanford along the Pacific Ocean, and I grew up in California. So yes, we are a Pacific power, and our allies and partners are all over the Indo-Pacific that we have obligations to. But China's regular retort is exactly that. So I think the until China kind of changes that fundamental perspective and is willing to pick up the phone and have mature conversations with us, even in areas that they disagree with, we're going to run the risk of a serious incident.
That's very sobering. Gita, you were talking a moment ago about America's fatigue with multipolarity and about your hopes that the meeting between Biden and Xi can introduce progress on AI and sustainability issues. You also know many of the Asian leaders well. So if you can put yourself in the office of various leaders throughout Southeast Asia, as they're watching President Biden and President Xi meet, what do you think they're going to be looking for to measure how it impacts their interests or their priorities?
I can speak for Southeast Asia. I can't speak for anything beyond, but we're all looking for money. That's what matters, right? This is a region that's not been good at attracting foreign direct investment, with the exception or absolute exception of Singapore, which has been the LeBron James when it comes to FDI and trade. But put this in the context of how the collective trade of ASEAN or Southeast Asia with China has grown. It's at $1 trillion right now. The only thing missing on the back of this massive trade accumulation, growing at about 15% per annum, is the lack of capital formation. So you talk to anybody in Southeast Asia, with the exception of anybody in Singapore, they would hope for this massive liquidity that's sitting in the United States and China to be allocated. But the irony with that is that the financial allocators have fiduciary responsibility, right, to the financial capital holders. And they can't allocate this capital without being accountable for good results or bad results. So the onus is partly on our side, where we've got to get our act together. But the problem is, all across the world, we're witnessing increasing political neurosis at the developing level and at the developed level. And that makes it tough, for conversations between developed economies and developing economies, as we're seeing some degree of political neurosis here too. So the United States and all other Western liberal democracy countries are flushed with more than $100 trillion worth of liquidity. That's a lot of potatoes and apples, right? And Boeings. You can take advantage of that for purposes of making sure that Southeast Asia becomes a modern nation. And this takes us to the sustainability point. You know, countries like India and Indonesia will need about 100 years to become modern, just to raise electrification from 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. I'm using 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita as the definition of modernity. And you need to be modern thinking to be able to understand the narrative of sustainability. That's not going to happen in a clean or environmentally friendly manner until and unless somebody in the developed economy goes, wow, we need to allocate this capital. Technology is there. But here's the other challenge. If you take a look at the fiscal space of developed economies, including here in the United States, I mean, the portion of the budget that's required to service the debt is already in excess of 20%, already in excess of defense budget. So you've got fiscal constraints in the United States and many other developed economies, and you've got more fiscal constraints on the developing economies. So I think this is a long game. If we were to sit here and expect that, you know, some short-term solutions are going to be attained, I think it's going to be unrealistic. So the key is to infuse realism in the discussions on sustainability and also artificial intelligence. I don't think that's going to kick in anytime soon until and unless somebody wakes up. Boy, this is going the wrong way.
Interesting. One of the issues that that I expect will be prominent when President Biden and President Xi sit down is Taiwan. And Oriana, you've spent a lot of time talking about, thinking about, writing about cross-strait issues. What do you expect the Chinese are going to bring to the table with President Biden, and how would you encourage him to respond?
The first thing I will say is the Chinese don't like to have exchanges on Taiwan. You know, so I don't think the Chinese goal here is like, why don't I sit down and have a conversation with President Biden about Taiwan? Because the way that they think about this political issue is it's an internal issue. So kind of what the United States has to say about it is the United States should have nothing to say about it. It's kind of their version of what Colin was talking about with the South China Sea, of like, everything would be better if you were just out. I mean, I will say when I was in Beijing last week, a lot of my Chinese interlocutors said that exact message to me, expecting me to push back. And I said, you're absolutely right. Like, you say that the United States is the reason like the world is not the way you want it to be. That is correct. The United States and our presence in Asia, it is the buffer that allows countries to pursue what is in their interests and not completely capitulate to Chinese demands. So on the Taiwan issue, I don't expect Xi Jinping to be like, okay, like, let me hear your views about Taiwan, President Biden. But I do expect him to make some pretty strong and serious sort of one unidirectional statements that will at the very least come out in any of the outbriefs in the Chinese media. You know, things like, you know, the United States thinks it's going to keep Taiwan and China apart. You know, they are wrong and they will pay, you know, an ultimate cost for these types of things. I mean, Zhang Youxia, who's the second highest military leader, only under, you know, Xi Jinping on the Central Military Commission, made those types of statements last week at the Xiangshan Forum. So I think, like, that's the first thing to kind of keep in mind, is they are trying to warn the United States in no uncertain terms. And this is a lot with the military activity. Increase in activity is not only just in the South China Sea, but we also see significant increases in military activity around Taiwan. And in my discussions with the Chinese military on this, it's extremely clear. This is their new version of peaceful unification. It is to show the island of Taiwan that there's no other option. Not the social and cultural exchanges between the two sides has led to such affinity that the people of Taiwan want to be a part of mainland China, but they see the writing on the wall. There is no other hope. And so China is really trying to convince the United States to get out of this issue, just like the South China Sea, because if we abandon Taiwan tomorrow, you better believe there is no way that Taiwan has any hope of possibly defending itself, not even against a full, you know, PLA military invasion, but against any form really of Chinese coercion. And so the leadership would have to rethink. In terms of, you know, so what is she trying to achieve at this meeting? I think it's just going to be the standard critique. And also a deep warning maybe in these private meetings that the direction of US policy, which some aspects, I would agree with the Chinese assessment, are designed to keep Taiwan an independent entity. You know, not in law, but de facto, trying to support Taiwan in many cases, you know, reduces the likelihood that these two sides will come together, warning the United States that those activities and policies, whether they be legislation, in the United States, visits by high-level officials, that those are extremely dangerous. And that Xi Jinping, doesn't want to fight a war over Taiwan, but he will. And if this becomes a war of necessity, not only will China use force against Taiwan, but it will be the fault of the United States. So just to piggyback off of what Colin said, the U.S. perspective is to highlight some of these issues in South China Sea and Taiwan so that the international community understands the context. But we also have to keep in mind that China is doing exactly the same. Because historically, when they're going to use force, they like it to be very clear that they were patient, that they warned many, many times before they did it, such that when they do use force, they say, this is completely legitimate. You are the one changing the status quo. You are the one threatening our security. We warned you so many times. We told you so many times to stop doing it, and you didn't do it. And so I think in that context, those are the types of statements that we're going to see coming out of Xi. And I'm sure, Biden, I think, I had a recent op-ed in which I argued unpopularly that I think in addition to the very clear warnings that any Chinese use of force will be met by a U.S. military response, there also has to be some reassurance messages that not only is the United States does not support Taiwan independence, but we are not against unification. I wouldn't say we're for unification. I think that is a bridge way too far. I mean, most people even think any sort of statement saying we're not against unification is a bit of a bridge too far. But just to be fair, that is the official U.S. policy, that we're not against unification. So if we can sort of normalize that type of message so it doesn't seem to be such a punch in the face in Taipei when we say things like that, I think that would be a useful way forward.
Well, I'm committed to getting everyone out of this room onto the rest of their day by 1 p.m. Which means that we have about 20 minutes left. I want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to react to anything that their fellow panelists said, but also any other issues that they would like to put on the table before we open up the floor to our audience. Brianna, Colin, Gita, Patty, anything that you felt like you wanted to respond to or add to?
I just think, Gita's hit on this a couple of times. I think that the U.S.-China rivalry is happening against the backdrop of two technological revolutions that are going to change the world. The way we interact, the way we live, the way we develop. And those two technological revolutions are the artificial intelligence revolution and the revolution in clean energy technology. Everything about our world will be different a couple decades from now through some combination of those two things. And there is no way that the United States and China are not going to compete around those technological revolutions. The United States and China have very different views about how the world should literally be wired. And as we digitize everything and artificial intelligence gets introduced into that, there actually is a competition of systems here that will be profound, and we shouldn't sugarcoat that. But both countries should have a common interest in preventing the existential risks that emerge from artificial intelligence. And I would identify the bio risk that emanates from these technologies, the systemic and democratized cyber risk to critical infrastructure that emerges from these technologies, any interaction between artificial intelligence and nuclear command and control, and then the prospect that accumulating gains and advances in artificial intelligence lead to an artificial general intelligence that is untethered from human goals, objectives, and control. And China doesn't have an interest in any of that stuff happening. Neither does the United States. So can there be some narrow cooperation, just like the two superpowers cooperated to eradicate smallpox at the height of the Cold War, or the nuclear nonproliferation regime to contain the proliferation of nuclear weapons that the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated on? So is there a version of that in AI? And likewise on clean energy, is there a narrow slice of cooperation that remains possible on climate change without, it can't be that China says, you have to give us everything we want on Taiwan, and then we'll cooperate with you on climate change, which is asinine, because it pretends as if it's a gift to us to help address the climate crisis, when the climate crisis is an existential threat to China too. The United States should not have to give China anything for them to cooperate on China and on climate change. And oh, by the way, we shouldn't expect anything in return either. There should be zone for cooperation on climate change because it is an existential threat to both of our countries, separate and apart from some bargaining space that we have between us. So we'll see if there's any room for cooperation that emerges in the coming years in these two areas of existential risk.
So I would just like to add, you know, in terms of what we expect in terms of this meeting and the future of the relationship. You know, for China, the U.S. relationship was the main show and has been the main show for decades. Even when they didn't like us, even when we have our ups and downs, there was always this viewpoint that their relationship with the United States was the foundation of everything that they wanted to achieve in the economic, military, and political spheres. I don't think that's the case anymore. It seems like, and this was not only, you know, the past 2 times, I guess, in the past month or so I've been to Beijing, it really seems like now we are the sideshow. And the main show more and more is China's relationship, in particular with the developing world and the rest of the world, and at least trying to equalize those things to create a balance with the relationship with the United States, whether it be sort of economically, this idea of like, okay, if we have a conflict with the United States, if there's any sanctions against us, you know, we don't want to, the Chinese are thinking they don't want to be so reliant on the US, so reliant on Europe. You know, what about other countries? What about trying to create markets in other countries, you know, for their trade? And so, you know, it does, when I was at Shangshan, it was obvious that all that messaging was not for us. You know, there were like 4 or 5 Americans there. And there were 3 Brits that we found, and we kind of like, you know, gathered together. But what really stuck out to me, and to be fair, I interact a lot with the Chinese and a lot with the US government, but I don't really interact a lot with the rest of the world. And so this might just be my ignorance, and then everyone else in the US government really has it together. But I'll say it anyway. I felt in many cases, a great discomfort with dealing with those countries that were there in Beijing. Like, I'm not used to going to lunch and like the Taliban is there, and the Iranians are there, and the North Koreans are there. And then, you know, others that have their own qualms about US policy, whether it be the Nicaraguans and Latin America, those from Timor-Leste, like everyone was really unhappy with the United States. And of course, I knew that. I know that there are these narratives in some of these countries, but for that to be the majority of the voices, I just thought, we always talk about the United States having to improve its game in the rest of the world, as 80% of the world lives in developing countries. But I think in some cases, it's hard for us to do that because the Chinese, it's not even like they felt uncomfortable. They're like, ugh, I don't like dealing with the new government of Afghanistan either, but I have to for strategic reasons. I mean, they didn't even seem to notice when they were kind of floating around. And then the second thing is, in some cases, not all, but it was a bit, you know, at Shangshan, a bit of an amateur hour. And so I'm also not used to, like, how are we supposed to deal with certain governments that don't have the same kind of standards of professionalism or rules of the road or what have you as we do. So, you know, I work on US-China relations, so I don't have any ideas for this, but it seems like this idea that the United States needs to really focus on having a set strategy for the developing world, that needs to be a key part of how we manage sort of China's role in the world. And that should be in addition, so that we can also sort of speak more broadly about issues with the Chinese and their impact, even beyond the conflict in the Middle East, beyond technologies. They are now having an impact everywhere in the world, for better or for worse. And I think the United States wants to have some say in that.
Again, I'll speak for Southeast Asia. This is a region that hasn't had more than 9 million lives lost in the last 2,000 years by way of differences of views or opinions with respect to ethnicity, religion, or race. That's a tiny number compared to what we saw in a span of 35 years in the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. So this is a region of peace and stability. And our interaction with China for the last 2,000 years has been predominantly commercial, not militaristic, not a warfare. So when I hear you guys, and I'm probably going to be on a limb here, because you know, the conversation is about power, right? And I think there are many of us in Southeast Asia who perceive the Chinese as having gone in the last 120 years from being kicked around to now, hey, dude, you know, we're going to be the largest economy in the world in the next few years. Whereas at the same time, the United States has gone in a matter of 10 to 20 years, the last 10 to 20 years, from being the only police, judge, and executive branch leader of the world to having to deal with this much more multipolar kind of world. And I would argue that China, I think, has been able to live in a multipolar world much longer, much better than the United States. So the adjustment for both sides, I think, will take time. And I would argue that the Southeast Asians, I think, have been a little bit disillusioned some years ago on the back of this pivot to Asia. Forgive me for saying that, because I went through that, right? The expectation was so high. I mean, you were there. I was on the other side. We were hoping for, you know, the candies. Never arrived. We thought we entered Toys R Us, you know, about to get lots of candies and whatever. So it was just, I would also argue, and this touches upon the politics of things, in the history of Southeast Asia's interactions with the US, we felt transactionally better whenever there was a Republican leadership in the US. I don't know why. I think it's probably because the Republicans, they tend to be much more entrepreneurial, and the Southeast Asians are transactional. They want to be entrepreneurial. They want to be transactional about this. So the shaping of Southeast Asia going forward in the context of this great power politics is to make sure that, you know, we're going to get engaged by the United States so that we could leverage all that for purposes of getting a better deal with the Chinese and vice versa. But at the moment, it's the Chinese that are allocating more goods and services and capital.
I want Patty to come in, but before we move, does that comment that you made about comfort with Republicans extend to 2020? Or would it extend
next year?
2024? Does the same logic apply?
You know, he's got a lot of friends in Indonesia. I'm talking about the other guy, not the current guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So he's got a lot of friends in Southeast Asia.
Okay. That's interesting. Okay.
So reacting to some of what's been said, I think, Oriana, what you laid out about Xiangshan, I think that completely shows that China has been investing more and more in the global south and in developing world to build up its own strategic allies and partners, just as the US has been investing a lot in strengthening our relationships with allies and partners. And, you know, I think China gains a lot, perhaps diplomatically, but it also creates risk for China. Right? And when things go up, people are going to expect China to respond, but I don't know if it's ready to do that. And also, I think it creates vulnerabilities where rogue players can try to play off China and the United States, and this could create perverse incentives, and you see that going on today. In terms of, we talked about sort of what does China want out of this meeting when it comes to Taiwan policy, you know, thinking about what will the people in Taiwan be looking at. I think they'll be looking very closely to make sure that President Biden, you know, characterizes U.S.-Taiwan policy, or that he doesn't seemingly make any concessions or promises that conveys weakened U.S. support for Taiwan, or any sort of endorsement of Beijing's aim for unification. And I don't expect that to happen, but of course they'll be watching very closely. But at the same time, I think the people of Taiwan would also be very alarmed if the meeting doesn't go well, and that there's no serious indication on either side of this desire to stabilize the relationship, because the risks of conflicts have high stakes for everyone involved, especially the people of Taiwan, who would most certainly be hit the hardest if there were to be some sort of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And I think these, you know, kind of considerations reflect how we talked about Southeast Asia, how U.S. allies and partners in Northeast Asia are often thinking, right? They're often sort of afraid that U.S.-China relations will swing to one extreme or the other, that it'll get too, you know, too sort of cozy, and that that the U.S. and China will create a G2 and they're going to call the shots while leaving everyone else on the sidelines. It's hard to imagine this kind of scenario here in the U.S. given the state of U.S.-China relations. But believe it or not, when Henry Kissinger went over to Beijing this summer, we got asked by a lot of Asian diplomats, oh, is this a sign of some sort of rapprochement or reset in the U.S.-China relations? And so there's always that kind of concern. And of course, there's a concern that things swing too much in the other way, where the U.S. and China are on the brink of conflict. And so I think people will be watching from around the world to make sure that the sort of the right balance is struck. And I think that's what sort of the Biden administration has done. They've been very clear that the U.S. Intends to stand firm on its values, stand behind allies and partners, but at the same time to work towards a more constructive relationship with China. And that's the tone that should be taken.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left. If anyone has any questions that they would like to raise, please feel free to raise your hand now, and I will call on you.
Hi, I'm Josh Kalanick, visiting scholar here and an Army officer from the War College. So Colin talked about this competition happening in the context of the sort of an AI revolution. Central to that AI revolution is the need for semiconductors. The Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company produces something like 60 to 70% of the most advanced chips. The U.S. has been very proactive about trying to deny China access to advanced chips through export controls, et cetera. I'm just wondering, how much does the semiconductor market factor into the United States and China's calculus on Taiwan, whether how proactive we would be in defending it versus their calculus on unification as we compete going forward with AI?
Great question. I'm going to hold on that for 1 second to see if anyone else would like to bring it on the table, and then we'll give our panelists a chance to react.
Dan Snyder from East Asian Studies here. So given the internal situation in China, particularly the slowdown in the economy and whatever ramifications are still there in terms of the way that COVID was managed and so on, how much pressure is there from within China on Xi Jinping, both first even just to have this meeting, but also to have a meeting that produces some kind of easing of tensions between the United States and China? So I mean, what sort of pushes Xi Jinping to the table? I think you've talked a lot about it from the other direction, but not so much from there.
Peter, you talk about AI and sustainability, and I'm an AI researcher myself. I know that 2019, United States had a almost not 800 pages long National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. From that report, the top issue is artificial intelligence education, AI education. And the Stanford actually produced a report that from the AI talents perspective, United States ranked number 13, unfortunately. We're not number 1. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on what do you mean exactly AI? Do you mean AI education?
Okay, so why don't we go around the horn here? We have 5 minutes left, and give everyone a chance to react to those questions. Colin, we'll start with you.
So I just on Josh, to your point, look, I think that a lot of the world sees the Taiwan issue as either a regional issue or, for some that lean towards the PRC perspective, as an internal Chinese issue. It's a global issue because of Taiwan's role in the global economy. 70% of all microchips, 90% of the highest end chips. Then you also factor in Taiwan's geography, which sits astride the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and the amount of trade that passes through there, the overall role in supply chains. Any conflict over Taiwan would lead to a global depression that shaved off trillions and trillions of dollars from the global economy. It would make COVID and the Russia-Ukraine conflicts look like economic blips. So the world has an incentive to not have that status quo be changed forcefully by either side. And that is the US policy. It is not Beijing's policy. Beijing's policy is to coerce Taiwan into capitulation, and if that proves impossible, to seize the island by force, and that would destroy the global economy. Whether the United States entered that conflict or not, it would destroy the world economy. So we have a collective human race interest in peace across the Taiwan Strait, and it's time for more countries, whether it's in Southeast Asia or in Europe, to put skin in the game on that, and not pretend that they can keep their head down between the two superpowers, and the collateral damage is not going to happen to them. They may not care about the Taiwan crisis, but the Taiwan crisis cares about them. So they need to focus on it, and we all need to work collectively to prevent it from getting really bad.
The three of you have it. I know you have a specific question addressed to you, but
I'll just say maybe something about the pressure on Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
You know, I have written extensively about how I think the threat of China, not right now, but maybe in a few years, of taking Taiwan by force is real. But none of it is about internal pressure on Xi Jinping. It's not like Xi Jinping is like, oh, I really don't want to have to deal with this Taiwan issue. But people inside are pushing me in that direction. I actually think the biggest threat comes more from assessment, confidence in assessments and their strength, especially military strength, than it does in insecurities. And I would say, you know, China doesn't really have this history, and I don't really see it there, of any sort of diversionary type of tactics. If things are bad economically, and they're so bad that like people are on the streets and the party is threatened, I think China really hunkers down, and we'll see a lot less activity. The only sort of caveat is if countries like the United States try to take advantage of that period of time to push our own interests, then China tends to respond extremely aggressively, because they have this narrative of the number one thing that leads to collapses of dynasties and maybe governments is the combination of internal instability and external pressure. But I will say that generally speaking, Xi Jinping has showed us with his COVID policy and with a lot of other things that it's not always the case that prosperity is more important than power and other national interests. And so, like Colin said, the idea that he'd be willing to pay an economic price for Taiwan, I think, is indisputable. The question is, what would that price be? I don't think he's willing to risk, you know, an economic collapse in China, but, you know, a 3 to 5 year decrease in GDP by 10%, I think that would be on the table. So the real question is, how much can we create a situation that makes it look like the economic costs would basically be the end of China as we know it, versus just painful for a couple of years and then they'd be able to recover.
Okay, we're at 1 o'clock right now. So if you have final thought, please.
I agree. I don't think he's doing it because of fiscal pressures. As long as there's nobody on the streets, as long as it's growing at about 2 to 3%, he's going to care about other things. But going back to AI, I'm in a camp that believes that AI, with all these hypnosis, they ought to be multidisciplinary. I'm in a camp that believes that AI ought to be open sourced. It ought to be not for profit. I think we shouldn't rush ourselves to be in a camp to be for profit and closed source, because we don't know, you know, what the perspectives of spirituality, economics, environment, philosophy, all the other things. I think this needs to be ushered forward in a highly multidisciplinary manner. And if I take a look at some governments, you know, they're very different in the way they're treating it. Japan is sort of like opening up the old kimono. Singapore, I think, is a lot more judicious. They're a lot more guarded and measured. Now, to put this in the context of Southeast Asia in terms of how this could be value additive, I'm on the board of, you know, a couple of AI-related companies in Southeast Asia. I think we're going to see a massive inflection in the next 5 years where we're going to be able to see 100 million people in Indonesia being able to speak English. You know, at the moment, not more than 5% of the population. That's only like 5 to 10 million people. But in the next 5 to 10 years, can you imagine if there's 100 million people in Indonesia that can speak English? If there's 400 million people in Southeast Asia out of 700 million people that can speak English, the contribution from an educational standpoint, economic standpoint, and all that good stuff, I mean, that's just enormous. So that's where I see, I think, where AI could be very value additive to places like Southeast Asia.